These images are not from the Eastern Front in Ukraine, from Kharkiv. The ice sculpture you see on the screen is the exterior of what was once a warm apartment building. This is Podolsk, just a few kilometers from Moscow. And this winter, the war came to Russia's doorstep like this. While the Kremlin used energy as a weapon to bring Ukraine to its knees, the eyes of the world were on the missiles and tanks. But the real battle was being fought silently and deeply within Russia's own lifelines. Now, in the fourth and most brutal winter of the war, Putin's strategy has backfired with one of history's greatest ironies. The weapon designed to freeze Ukraine has turned its barrel around and is now shooting its owner. This is no accidental malfunction. It is the inevitable result of decades of decaying infrastructure being sacrificed to feed the war machine. For millions of Russian citizens, the war is no longer a propaganda show watched on television. It is a bone-chilling cold felt inside their homes. To understand the origins of this total collapse, we must look beyond a burst pipe or a burning transformer and examine the first domino that started the chain reaction, the Kremlin's deliberate choices. This catastrophe is not an accident, but the physical manifestation of a series of decisions signed on paper with priorities clearly defined. It all began on the day the 2025 federal budget was announced in the Duma. In the 2025 budget, funding for civil infrastructure, health, education and social services was dramatically cut overnight. Vladimir Putin announced that he was raising defense spending to a record level unseen since the Cold War, exceeding 7% of gross domestic product. This meant that 7 out of every 100 rubles produced by the country would go directly to the war machine. This massive fund, earmarked for new tanks, hypersonic missiles, and hundreds of thousands of new soldiers, was a declaration that the Kremlin was prepared to pay any price for victory. However, who would pay this price was quietly hidden in the footnotes of the budget. In this vast country, spread across 11 time zones, millions of people are now victims not only of war, but also of neglect and destruction. Last winter, hundreds of thousands of people in 43 different regions were forced to live for days without heat, water, or electricity due to burst pipes and collapsed heating systems in temperatures reaching -30 degrees. Now the same crisis is looming again. This time the situation is even more dire because Putin's Russia is preparing to freeze not only at the front, but also in its cities. The energy infrastructure has collapsed, municipalities have gone bankrupt, and local governments are powerless. To understand this infrastructure crisis threatening Russia, we need to go back in time to the heart of the Soviet Union. In the 20th century, Soviet engineers built a massive industrial civilization in one of the world's most challenging geographies. Hundreds of thousands of kilometers of heating pipes, water networks, and power lines stretching from the frozen soils of Siberia to the industrial centers of the Urals were an artery system that kept millions of people alive. However, this system was born with a flaw. It was not designed to last forever. Every pipe, every pump, every power plant had an expiration date, and that date had long passed. In the chaos of the 1990s following the collapse of the Soviet Union, this massive infrastructure was completely abandoned to its fate. Looting and chronic corruption under the guise of privatization swallowed up the funds that should have been allocated for maintenance and repair, one by one. Although some investment was made with the wealth provided by oil revenues after Putin came to power, this was merely a band-aid solution for the most urgent problems, far from solving the massive issue. According to experts, Russia's municipal infrastructure needs a renewal rate of at least 5% annually to remain functional without decaying. However, the average investment made over the last 20 years has been less than 1%. This is like ignoring a small leak in the roof of a house for years. What initially seems like a minor problem gradually rots the entire structure. And one day, when you least expect it, the whole roof collapses on you. This is exactly what is happening in Russia. The total deterioration rate of heating, water, and sewage networks has exceeded 70%, even according to official figures. The system is self-destructing much faster than it can be replaced. And the war in Ukraine delivered the final blow that triggered this collapse. The Kremlin made a choice: a new T-90 tank or a new heating pipe to prevent a city in Siberia from freezing this winter. The Kremlin chose the tank, without hesitation. The 2024 to 2026 federal budget is the clearest evidence of this ruthless choice. Defense and internal security spending has skyrocketed to over 40% of the total budget, a level unseen even during the Soviet era. That's approximately 17.4 trillion rubles, or more than $170 billion. So where does this money come from? Directly from the people's pockets and their future. To finance this massive war budget, the Kremlin is cutting everything related to civilian life, one by one. Education, health, the environment. But the most ruthless cut was made to the housing and public utilities budget. This budget has been cut by a full 43% starting in 2025. And as if that weren't enough, an additional 25% cut is planned for 2026. These figures are not the cold data of an economic bulletin. This is a mathematical prediction of what millions of people will experience this winter. This means fewer repairs, less maintenance, fewer emergency interventions, and inevitably, more burst pipes, more cities plunged into darkness, and more people freezing. Last winter, hundreds of thousands of people in at least 43 different regions of Russia experienced this nightmare. This happened when there were not yet such large cuts in the budget. Now, with these cuts, the fear that what happened last winter was just a preview and that the real movie will start this winter has gripped the entire country. So how terrible was that preview? The symbol of the infrastructure disaster in the winter of 2023 to 2024 was undoubtedly the industrial city of Podolsk, right next to Moscow. On the coldest days of January, when temperatures dropped to -20, even -30 degrees, a boiler room in Klimovsk, one of the city's main heating sources, shut down. This was no ordinary malfunction. Tragically, ironically, this boiler room was part of an ammunition factory. In other words, a facility that was supposed to produce bullets to be sent to Ukraine was unable to heat the city it was located in. The result was a complete disaster. Approximately 150,000 people, including tens of thousands of children and elderly, were suddenly trapped in their freezing homes. The temperature inside the apartments dropped below zero. The windows froze from the inside, and people's breath began to vaporize in the air. As the water in the heating system froze, the pipes turned into massive blocks of ice and burst. This meant not only the loss of heating, but also the loss of clean water. Schools and hospitals had to close. Critically ill patients in hospitals were kept alive with electric heaters powered by generators. The helplessness of the people of Podolsk spread around the world through images shared on social media. People lit fires in front of their apartment buildings to avoid freezing, sat in their cars for hours to stay warm, or tried to gather the entire family in a single room around an open stove. This resembled a dystopian movie scene unfolding right next to the capital of one of the world's largest energy producers in the 21st century. And Podolsk was not alone. According to data compiled by independent media outlets and local sources, large-scale infrastructure failures occurred in at least 43 different regions of Russia that winter, covering nearly half the country. Many other cities such as Lyubertsy, Solnechnogorsk and Khimki in the Moscow Oblast experienced similar, albeit smaller scale, mass heating and power outages. In St. Petersburg, hundreds of apartment buildings were left without heat for days, while a burst main pipeline turned a street into a giant cloud of steam and a lake of boiling water. In Novosibirsk, the heart of Siberia, a boiling water flood caused by the rupture of one of the main heating pipes engulfed cars on the roads, seriously burned at least 14 people, and turned a significant part of the city into a deadly ice rink. Even in Volgograd and Rostov-on-Don in the south, when temperatures dropped below zero, thousands of people struggled with power and heating outages. In Vladivostok and Nakodka in the Far East, severe snowstorms snapped aging power lines, leaving tens of thousands without electricity for days. The list goes on. While each incident appeared to occur in a different city for a different reason, there was a common underlying reality. Soviet-era infrastructure, neglected for decades, patched together to stay functional, and now nearing the end of its lifespan, was collapsing like dominoes under the additional stress of the war economy. So, when a heating pipe bursts or a power plant shuts down, what exactly are the problems that affect civilian life? This is not a simple loss of comfort. It triggers a chain reaction that paralyzes modern urban life. The first and most obvious consequence is the loss of heating. At -30 degrees, this turns into a survival crisis within hours. Without heating, the water in the pipes in buildings and underground freezes. The frozen water expands and bursts tens of thousands of kilometers of aging pipe networks. Result, even if the heating comes back, there is no water left in the city. This also means the end of drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene. When the water flow stops and the temperature drops, sewage systems also freeze and become blocked. This means sewage flooding apartment basements and the risk of a horrific public health crisis. Millions of people without heating turn to one thing at the same time: electric heaters. However, the Soviet-era electrical grids, already overloaded, cannot handle this sudden and massive increase in demand. Transformers explode, fuses blow, and regional power outages begin. There is now no heating, no water, and no electricity. This means that a city's civil functions come to a complete halt, regressing decades in a matter of hours. While this horrific scenario unfolds, the Kremlin's propaganda machine lives in a completely different reality. State television broadcasts daily images of Putin talking about a strong and sovereign Russia, technological achievements, and an unshakable will that brings the West to its knees. Putin speaks at international forums about how stable and prosperous Russia is. However, when you juxtapose these glossy propaganda images with the real-life images Russians themselves have captured and shared on social media, what emerges is a montage of shame. On one side, Putin speaking in a gilded palace. On the other, an elderly woman crying because the temperature inside her home has dropped below freezing. On one side, shiny tanks advancing in military parades. On the other, a massive cloud of steam spewing from a rusty heating pipe that exploded in the middle of a city. The gap between these two realities is growing wider by the day, and no propaganda can warm you when your radiators are ice cold. No lie can quench your thirst when no water flows from your tap. The Kremlin is deliberately sacrificing not only the economy, but also the most basic living conditions of its people to continue the war. This is a ruthless war of attrition, waged by the state against its own citizens. So what if this winter brings a catastrophe far worse than last year's? What if the heating system of a metropolis like Moscow, St. Petersburg, or Yekaterinburg, home to millions of people, completely collapses in the midst of a -30°C cold snap? This is not just a humanitarian crisis, it is also a political apocalypse scenario that could fundamentally shake the regime. In such a situation, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people would face the risk of freezing to death. Hospitals, schools, and all public buildings would close. Water pipes in the city would freeze and burst, and the sewage system would collapse. This would mean the complete cessation of a city's modern life functions. At this point, people's patience would run out. Protests would no longer be political actions involving just a few activists. They would turn into outbursts of anger by hundreds of thousands of people pouring into the streets to survive, known as heat riots. People could block roads, storm municipal buildings, and demand that their basic needs be met. The Kremlin's response to such an uprising is clear. It will blame local governors and mayors entirely for incompetence, try to appease the public by dismissing a few people, and finally, if the uprising cannot be suppressed, send OMON riot police and National Guard troops into the streets. However, using such extreme violence against its own people could completely destroy the regime's legitimacy, even in the eyes of its own base. What is the point of this war if Putin's army cannot heat Ukraine while his own people freeze in their homes? This question begins to echo in the minds of even his most loyal supporters. This internal instability will inevitably affect global markets. A Russia grappling with infrastructure crises in its own cities could become an even more unpredictable and unstable actor in global energy markets. This situation has the potential to create new shockwaves in oil and gas prices. Now all of Russia is holding its breath, waiting for the first major cold snap of winter. Weather reports are now read like prophecies that will determine not only the weather, but also the fate of the country. When those first -20, -30 degrees arrive, inevitable reports of breakdowns will start coming in from all corners of the country. The Kremlin's propaganda machine will attempt to present these failures as local and isolated incidents, blame Western saboteurs, or call on the people to make a little more sacrifice for the motherland. But the truth is stubborn. And this winter, the truth will blow into every home in Russia like an icy wind. This is the story of how a regime, for the sake of its own geopolitical ambitions, brought its people to the brink of disaster. This is the story of a frozen empire, But this collapse is not only happening in the pipes and power plants. As Russia freezes this winter, this collapse is also being felt, much more quietly, much more insidiously, but just as destructively, on supermarket shelves and in pharmacies. If you walk into a bright, well-lit supermarket in central Moscow today, it's hard to tell at first glance that there is a crisis. The shelves appear full. This is the most important showcase for the regime's "everything is fine" propaganda, broadcast to the public every evening on state television. But if you look a little closer, you begin to see the bitter truth behind those shiny packages. First of all, most of the familiar brands are gone. The real shock comes when you look at the price tags. Inflation, far beyond the official figures, is eating away at people's purchasing power like a monster. We saw this most clearly in the famous egg crisis last winter, the effects of which are still being felt. One of the most basic, simplest food items, eggs, suddenly became a luxury consumer product. A dozen eggs that cost 100 rubles a year ago now cost 250 rubles, if you're lucky enough to find them on the shelf. This situation is not limited to eggs. The prices of the most basic necessities, such as chicken, dairy products, vegetables and fruit, have increased by an average of 30 to 40% in the last year. While official inflation figures hover around 8%, the real shelf inflation in the kitchen of an ordinary family is more than 4 times that. This situation is a complete disaster, especially for millions of people with fixed and low incomes, such as pensioners and public sector employees. For a family that has to spend 50% or even 60% of its monthly income just on food, every small increase in food prices directly means less food on the table or lower quality. However, the quietest, most invisible and most deadly front of this collapse is not in the supermarkets, but in the pharmacies. The damage caused by the war and sanctions on Russia's healthcare system has turned into a full-blown humanitarian crisis. Theoretically, medicines and medical supplies are not directly subject to sanctions as they fall under humanitarian aid. However, the reality is very different. First, many large Western pharmaceutical companies have voluntarily withdrawn from the Russian market, either for ethical reasons or due to operational difficulties. Second, the removal of Russian banks from the international SWIFT system has made it extremely difficult and complicated for even the remaining companies to collect payment for medicines. Third, the disruption of logistics chains prevents medicines requiring a sensitive cold chain from being safely delivered to the country. The result is evident on pharmacy shelves. Millions of people with chronic conditions such as hypertension, diabetes, heart disease and asthma can no longer find the effective Western medicines they have been using for years. The only alternative offered to them is usually less effective and more side effect-prone Russian equivalents. This means a decline in the quality of life and increased health risks for millions of people. The Kremlin's choice to feed its war machine is sacrificing not only the young people on the front lines, but also the elderly, the sick, and the children behind the front lines. Every $1 million spent on a Kalibr cruise missile launched at Ukraine is actually a cancer drug that a hospital in Russia cannot afford, a blood pressure pill that a pensioner cannot afford, and a package of baby formula that a family cannot afford. This is a silent war that Putin is waging against his own people, one that is just as destructive as the war in Ukraine. And in this war, the casualties are not soldiers, but the most innocent and vulnerable. Thank you for watching.